مساء الخير طلابنا الأعزاء، وأهلا بكم في محاضرة جديدة من محاضرات مادة الهيستولوجي العملي. محاضرتنا لليوم حتكون عن اليورينري سيستم أو ما يسمى بالجهاز البولي. The urinary system consists from different parts like 2 kidneys and 2 ureter, urinary bladder and urethra. Each kidney contains many parts like cortex, medulla, pyramids, papilla, pelvis, and calyx. The first part is called the cortex, which is the outer part of the kidney. Consists from the dense fibrous connective tissue. This is the cortex. In the inner portion of the kidney, this is the medullary region or medulla region. In the medulla region, there is a special structure called the pyramid. This is the pyramid. At the tip of each pyramid, there is a narrow structure or narrow opening, which is called the papilla. This is the papilla region or renal papilla. Also, we have the pelvis or renal pelvis, which is an extension of the upper end of the ureter. The renal pelvis is lined by a transitional epithelium. Finally, we have the calyx. We have two types of the calyx, the minor calyx and the major calyx. Each calyx is a division of the renal pelvis. Opening into each calyx is the papilla of the pyramid, lined by transitional epithelium. Now we'll talk about the nephrons. Each kidney contains 1 million of functional units called nephrons. Each nephron contains two parts, the renal corpuscle or Malpighian corpuscle and the renal tubules. The renal corpuscles also contains two parts, A, the glomerulus, which is a tuft of capillaries, and Bowman's capsule, which consists from two layers, internal layer or visceral layer and the external layer or parietal layer. Between these layers or between two layers, there is a urinary space which receive the fluids filtered through the capillary wall. The renal tubules, we have three tubules, renal tubules, A, proximal convoluted tubules, B, Henle's loop, which is composed of thick descending limb of Henle's loop, similar in structure to the proximal convoluted tubules. Number 2, thin segments of Henle's loop, ascending and descending. This segments lined by squamous epithelial cell. And number 3, thick ascending limb of Henle's loop, which is lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. And at last, we have the distal convoluted tubules. In this figure, we will note the renal corpuscle and the renal tubules. The renal corpuscle consists from two parts, the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. The renal corpuscle with renal tubules will form the nephron. The first part of the renal tubules is the proximal convoluted tubule. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. This part attached to the thick descending limb of Henle loop, and the thick descending attached to the thin descending loop of Henle. On the other hand, there is the thin ascending and thick ascending loop of Henle. At last, there is the distal convoluted tubule. This is the distal convoluted tubule. Again, the nephron consists from two parts. These parts is the renal corpuscle and renal tubules. The first part of the renal tubules is the proximal convoluted tubule. This is the proximal convoluted tubule, which is attached to the thick descending, and the thick descending attached to the thin descending loop of Henle. And on the other hand, there is the thin ascending loop of Henle, and the thin ascending attached to the thick ascending loop of Henle, and finally there is the distal convoluted tubule. Also, this figure illustrates the renal corpuscle, and inside the renal corpuscle there is the glomerulus, which is a tuft of capillaries, and the Bowman's capsule. This is the Bowman's capsule. Also, we note the renal tubules. The first part of renal tubules is the proximal convoluted tubule, and the second part is the thick descending loop of Henle, which is attached to the thin descending loop of Henle, and the thin ascending and thick ascending loop of Henle, and at last there is the distal convoluted tubules. On this slide, we'll note the proximal convoluted tubules. These are the proximal convoluted tubules, and this section is a cross section in the proximal convoluted tubules in the kidney. The proximal convoluted tubules are lined by simple cuboidal epithelium, whose cells have several characteristic features. The apical end of each cell has a brush border of microvilli. This is the brush border of microvilli. Now we'll talk about the other part in the urinary system, which is called the ureter. The ureter is a hollow tube delivering urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. The ureter consists from three parts: the mucosa of three layers, the mucosa, which is the first layer, and the muscularis layer, and the adventitia or fibrosa. The mucosa in the ureter consists from two parts: the epithelium and the lamina propria. The type of epithelium in the mucosa of the ureter is the stratified transitional epithelium, while the lamina propria consists from a dense, irregular fibroelastic connective tissue. The other layer in the ureter is the muscularis layer, which is also consists from two layers of smooth muscle. The outer layer is arranged circularly, and the inner layer is longitudinally. In the muscularis layer, we have two layers of smooth muscles. The outer layer, which is arranged circularly, and the inner layer is longitudinally. And finally, we have adventitia or fibrosa in the ureter. It is composed of fibroelastic connective tissue with adipose tissue, and it contains numerous blood vessels and a small nerve. In this diagram of a cross section in the ureter, we can note the layers of the ureter. The first one is the mucosa. This is the mucosa. The second one is the muscularis layer, and the third layer is the adventitia or cirrhosis. The mucosa in the ureter contains two parts: the epithelium, and the epithelium of the ureter is the transitional epithelium or urothelium, which is arrested on the lamina propria. This layer is the lamina propria. The lamina propria contains fibroelastic connective tissue. The second layer the muscularis layer, contains two types of muscles, inner longitudinal and outer circular. The third layer, which is called the serose or adventitia, contains fibroelastic connective tissue, adipose tissue, nerve, and blood vessels. In these two sections in this slide, we can note clearly the layers of the ureter. This space is the lumen of the ureter. The first layer is the mucosa, and this layer is the epithelium of the mucosa. The type of epithelium in the ureter is the transitional epithelium, which is arrested on the lamina propria. This layer is the lamina propria. The lamina propria contains fibroelastic connective tissue. Also, the lamina propria is surrounded by another layer, which is called the muscularis layer. This layer is the muscularis layer. On the other slide, also we can note clearly the lumen of the ureter. This is the lumen of the ureter, and the epithelium, transitional epithelium, lamina propria, and the muscularis layer. This is the muscularis layer with the smooth muscles fiber. Finally, we will talk about the last part in the urinary system, which is called the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder wall contains many different layers. The first one is the mucosa, the second one is the submucosa, the third layer is the muscularis layer, and at last the serose or adventitia. The mucosa of the urinary bladder contains two parts. The first one is the epithelium, and the second one is the lamina propria. The epithelium in the urinary bladder is the transitional epithelium, stratified transitional epithelium, which is arrested on the lamina propria. The loose connective tissue in the lamina propria contains many elastic fibers. The second layer is the submucosa. This layer contains areolar connective tissue, blood vessel, nerve, and glands. The third layer is the muscularis layer. This layer contains two different types of smooth muscles, circular and longitudinal. And finally, the serose or adventitia, which consists from the connective tissue.